go ahead and get us started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeannie Braha. I'm the Executive Director of Rock Creek Conservancy. We are the philanthropic and stewardship partner to Rock Creek Park, and really thrilled to have Kim Elder moderating our panel tonight. Kim is the manager of the Civil War Defenses of Washington program. Some of those Civil War defenses are inside of Rock Creek Park. Some of them are elsewhere, and she can share more about that at her leisure. But we are here tonight as part of the Race History and Rock Creek program. And that program really aims to tell all the stories of Rock Creek Park. So all the wonderful places that you've seen and been and go to or have yet to visit. There are so many different stories associated with those and the people that have been involved in those special places even before it was a national park. And through this program series, we tell many of those stories. So if you have a story you haven't heard yet, we would love to hear about it. Put it in the chat or email us, and maybe we'll be able to develop a future program. But tonight, we are really thrilled to be partnering with the Military Road School Preservation Trust and the National Association of Colored Women's Club for this particular program, which is a virtual celebration of the 100th anniversary of Lincoln Thomas Day. And I'm sure you're saying to yourself right now, what is Lincoln Thomas Day? I've heard of a Lincoln. Who's this Thomas? The good news is you're going to find out about that. Kim Elder, our moderator for the evening, is going to introduce our panelists and get us started with the program. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you, everybody, for your participation this evening.
Good evening, all, and thank you, Jeannie, and the Rock Creek Conservancy for the invitation to share with you all on this evening. Just a little bit of information about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas and, of course, Abraham Lincoln, and why we are celebrating, in fact, the centennial celebration of Lincoln Thomas Day. Tonight, we have joining with us Marvin Tupper Jones. Marvin is not only a member of the Military Road School Preservation Trust, he is the producer of the film we're going to watch very, very shortly. In addition to Marvin on our panel this evening, Marvin, give them a wave so they'll know who you are.
Hello.
Thank you so very much. In addition to Marvin, we have the president of the Military Road School Preservation Trust, Miss Elizabeth, Miss Patricia Tyson. Patricia Tyson, would you give them a wave as well so they could see you? All right. And then we have very special guests tonight with us. We have the National Association of Colored Women's Club Incorporated. We have the National First Vice President, Ms. Denise Williams. Ms. Williams, if you would be so kind as to give them a wave. Thank you so very much. That was very queenly, ma'am. And of course, we have Ms. Linda Nance. Ms. Nance is the National Historian for the National Association of Colored Women's Club. And again, it is our very pleasure to have them with us on this evening. We have many, many persons representing the National Association of Colored Women's Club, including Ms. Opal Bacon. Ms. Bacon, the national president, if you would be so kind as to give us a wave as well. Thank you so very much for joining us. We do thank each and every one of you all for joining. As Jeannie mentioned, there are lots of familiar faces on the call tonight. Many of my colleagues with the National Park Service are on the call as well. Many community leaders and just people who are interested in learning more about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas and, of course, her connection with our 16th President of the United States, President Abraham Lincoln. At this time, I'm going to ask that we turn our attention to the film that is about to be shared on the screen. Again, the producer, Mr. Marvin Tupper Jones, is with us. We're going to have him talk a little bit later about the film, but we want to provide some context for you. So at this moment, just for a brief pause, there'll be a brief pause as we share the screen. Again, this film is about 10 minutes long. As I always share with people, the idea of interpretation or sharing this history is that it's meant to encourage you to learn more. It's meant to encourage you to seek more information. So we don't have it all for you. And so we're going to leave you with lots more to want tonight. But at this time, we're going to turn our attention to the screen and listen to this very important and short, brief film about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas.
The Alliance to Preserve the Civil War Defenses of Washington, D.C. You will see a film about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, who made a significant contribution to the Battle of Fort Stevens, and you will also see afterwards how she is remembered today. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Washington, D.C.'s historic Fort Stevens. My Aunt Betty owned this land. Aunt Betty's maiden name was Elizabeth Proctor. Aunt Betty was my great-great-aunt. She was born in 1821 in Charles County, Maryland. She was born free. She was from a family of free people, which meant that they could move about, they could purchase property, and in 1840 they purchased a tract of land that is now Fort Stevens. And Aunt Betty, by will of her grandmother, who was my fourth great-grandmother, got 8 acres of property at Fort Stevens. One historian described the property as a beautiful spot which controlled the entrance to the District of Columbia because of its strategic location.
Her property was perhaps the most important piece in the fort circles that surrounded Washington as the defense to protect the nation's capital.
Jubal Early had decided to amass his Confederate troops and was going to attack the nation's capital. The Battle of Fort Stevens occurred July 11th and 12th of 1864. Unfortunately, during that process, they took everything. They tore down her home, and she fought. She did not want to leave, but they tore down her home. All the orchids and trees were destroyed. Her livestock, she had cows, pigs, horses. All of her livestock was taken to feed the troops. They built rifle pits on the property, which meant that it could not be farmed. Her home had a cellar. They took over the cellar and they expanded it to build one of the 2 magazines that they built at Fort Stevens. And basically she lost everything. Now, an event occurred at that time, just before the war started, and I think that that event had an extraordinary impact on her life. So I'd like to read you in her words what happened when they took her property. The soldiers camped here, referring to her property, at this time were mostly German. I could not understand them, not even the officers, but when they began taking out my furniture and tearing down our house, I understood. In the evening, I was sitting under that sycamore tree, my only house, with what furniture I had left around me. I was crying, as was my 6-month-old child, which I had in my arms, when a tall, slender man, dressed in black, came up and said to me, "It is hard, but you shall reap a great reward." It was President Lincoln, and had he lived, I know the claim for my losses would have been paid. At that very moment, her attitude changed, and Aunt Betty forgot about her losses and sprung into action to support the Union troops. She helped them with the ammunition that was stored in the stone cellar of what was left of the house. She did carry a rifle in case she ran into any Rebs, as she described them.
And she herself had a little gun she taught by her side.
She fed them, she cooked for them, she did laundry for them. She fully supported the Union troops that were encamped on her property for 3 years. After the war, she continued to stay there. Of course, some of the property was not available for farming anymore, but she continued to keep in touch with some of the Union troops who had served at Fort Stevens. When they would come to town, they would come to her house, and her home really became the hub of the community. Yes, she was a hero, and for many years she was an unrecognized hero. And I think these are the best heroes or heroines in life, those who are unexpected heroes, who go about their lives and live their normal lives, and no one knows who they are. And then there's an event, that one event, that sparks them into action. And regardless of their losses, they rise up and do what's best for the greater good, and she did that. In January of this year, Muriel Bowser, council member of the DC City Council, proposed to name a street where Aunt Betty lived, Quackenboss Street Northwest, after her. And during the introduction of the legislation, she mentioned the fact that Aunt Betty was never reimbursed, that she lost everything, and she was a good citizen, and that she deserved some recognition.
This event of the Civil War, which was, by the way, referred to by one of the generals in the war that fought here as the defining moment, possibly in American history, for the moral character of which way was this country going to go.
Elizabeth Proctor Thomas was born in 1824 to 1917. She was a free woman of color. She inherited her farm from her grandmother, and she continued on after the war to have a presence in her neighborhood. She was president of the Elizabeth Thomas Citizens Association in the Brightwood neighborhood where Fort Stevens is located. She participated in Flag Day and other patriotic programs in Washington, D.C. schools. And she helped form a parent-teacher federation at a local school, likely the nearby Military Road School, which was formed the same year of the Battle of Fort Stevens and of Fort Stevens Barracks. In 1911, the monument mentioned earlier was erected to commemorate the Battle of Fort Stevens, where President Lincoln stood during the battle. You see Mrs. Thomas sitting with some of the Union veterans. She was included in the dedication program. And at the fort, on the lower left in this photograph, you see a magazine, a fort magazine, and the fort magazine is part of her original cellar. Behind the cellar is the wall where the monument is located. When Ms. Thomas died in 1917, leading Washington newspapers such as the Evening Star and the Washington Bee gave her more than the usual obituary, gave her lengthy articles. In 1911, the monument mentioned earlier was erected to commemorate the Battle of Fort Stevens, where President Lincoln stood during the battle. You see Mrs. Thomas sitting with some of the Union veterans. She was included in the dedication program. And just across from that marker is Fort Stevens and the intersection of 13th Street and Quackenboss overlooking Fort Stevens. In 2014, Patricia Tyson and Ms. Thomas's niece, Alice Harris, lobbied to rename Quackenboss Street. And later that year, it was successfully named Elizabeth Thomas Way. Every year in September, Lincoln Thomas Day is held on the grounds of Fort Stevens to honor the meeting of President Lincoln and Mrs. Thomas. And at Fort Stevens, people gather around, tents are erected. The program that you're seeing there is always held at 13th and Elizabeth Thomas Way. Thank you for joining us on this presentation about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas and her wonderful life. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much for your attention to that short film, short but quite informative film. As I noted before the film began, it is our goal to encourage you to learn more about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas and all that she did on the grounds. I often refer to her not only as the most famous resident of Brightwood, but she is the original property owner of what we now know as Fort Stevens. So at this time, I'd like to just ask the producer, Mr. Tupper Jones, Marvin, to share with us any information that he acquired as he was producing the film, any new information you found out about the film or about Ms. Thomas while you were getting it, and what inspired you to produce the film, sir?
I was on a production team at DCTV, which is the District of Columbia's cable TV network. And I was already friends with Alice Harris, Miss Proctor's great niece. And she pitched the idea of her aunt. And I had heard of Elizabeth Thomas just a little bit. I live only a mile away. And still do. I sell a mile away from Fort Stevens. So the team approved my idea of doing this film, and she also introduced me to Patricia Tyson. And so Miss Tyson, I've been partnering ever since. This film is now 10 years old, and we've been in lockstep ever since. That's one beauty of the film for me. A lot of what is in the film is pretty much what can be learned about Ms. Thomas. There are others, I believe, who've done more research, she still, at the time of the film, she still had relatives in the area, people who were descended from her, and also collateral descendants who live in Brightwood at the time the film was produced.
Thank you so very much. And you referenced other references that we could possibly go to. I think of Dr. Cooling, Dr. Frank Cooling's books, many of his books, but one specifically that speaks greatly about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas is one of his last books, The Day Lincoln Was Almost Shot. And he talks about the encounter between Abraham Lincoln and Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. So there are more, and we'll place all these references that we are referring to this afternoon in the chat. Again, there's little known about her in terms of print. We have been able to uncover great history over the years. Now, let's go back, speaking of years, let's go back to an organization that was very much so a part of developing and commemorating what we now know as Lincoln Thomas Day. Thank you again, Mr. Jones, for your information. I'd like to turn the attention right now to the National Association of Color Women's Club and who they are, how they got involved, what inspired the organization to do, to want to take the time to honor her. So I'm going to turn it now to the national historian for the National Association of Color Women's Club, Ms. Nance, to tell us a little bit about the organization and how all of this came about, how the organization came about and learning more about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. Ms. Nance?
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate that and appreciate being here. Our organization is one that started in 1896. We are at this particular point 128 years old, and should I say 128 years proud. And we have been about the business of sharing with women all over this nation opportunities for women to look at education and health kind of issues for women, looking at raising of the children in our families, opportunities to represent women of color in all the best lights we possibly can. We have been, as an organization, involved in saving pieces of our history so that we can make sure that the story is carried on. In fact, our motto is lifting as we climb, and we take those opportunities very seriously. So when Ms. Thomas was involved and Lincoln was involved, I can tell you in 1924, in a biennial conference, I think it was our 6th conference, and it was in Chicago. And we basically had a resolution that says we should honor Abraham Lincoln. And in doing that, we learned about Ms. Thomas. We learned that they had a relationship that said, I have to have this property to protect our nation, but understand, Ms. Thomas, you will be compensated. That's our understanding. So that's a story that we wanted to get behind as we congratulated all the things that Abraham Lincoln did for people of color in this nation. Thus coming, there were 3 different dates, I do believe, that we were looking at for the celebration of Abraham Lincoln. One of them was his birthday in February. The other was the 22nd of September, which was the date he first did the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And the other was, of course, the date it was ratified, January 1, which is a date a lot of people consider our emancipation. The first of the year is when it was ratified in 1866, I believe. And that's one of those dates. So it turned out September the 22nd was the day that we celebrate the Lincoln Thomas Day, commemorating both those things: the President of the United States who signed the Emancipation, and the lady who provided a lot of opportunity for our nation to remain safe. The other part of that is a story that basically says when he was there, when our nation was attacked by the Confederate Army, he went to the fort, which was Fort Stevens, and he was up on the parapet, which is the piece that you observe battles in. And it was said that she said, "Get down, because you're the president, you don't need to be shot." So it's a possibility that she saved his life as well. Stories kind of get mixed up through history, and maybe another person was credited for that, but she surely, just as Ms. Tyson said, carried that weapon and tried to make sure that the people that she worked with at the fort remained safe. So that's part of the reason why it got started and why we commemorate it and want to draw attention to it from people all over the world, all over the United States for sure.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so much. And I want to take a moment just to ask that if you have any questions, there's so much to share this evening, but if you have questions, place those questions in the chat. Ms. Nance and Ms. Williams and Mr. Jones and Ms. Tyson are all looking forward to answering any of the questions that you have. Again, there's a lot of information to be shared, and we look forward to sharing more with you and maybe even diving a little deeper with your questions. So be sure to bring those questions to us. Ms. Williams, Denise Williams, the first national vice president for the National Association of Color Women's Club. I'd like for you to perhaps share with us again more about the organization and again, just how the organization has continued its motto of climbing as we, lifting as we climb and climbing as we lift. And then again, just the involvement with African Americans and African American women. And then we'll tie all this in as a nice bow really shortly. I promise you all that. But I wanted to have them share again more about the organization. And if you want to, again, just elaborate more on how you all are being involved with the Lincoln Thomas Day 100 years later, as we are preparing to commemorate the 100th anniversary next weekend on the historic grounds of Fort Stevens.
Well, good evening.
Mhm.
Just piggybacking off of what our national historian Linda Nance has said, the National Association of Color Women's Clubs has always been involved with women, children, and families. We started out creating kindergartens, after school programs. We continued with educational programs. We're still involved today with educating young women, Black women, through economic empowerment, through financial stability, through legislation. And so we are continuing those practices today. We are still standing on our motto of lifting as we climb. So we have programs that are uplifting women, because as we climb, we have to uplift others. And so we found that in Miss Elizabeth Thomas. She took what she had to lift up the United States of America. She sacrificed, well, she didn't really sacrifice, they kind of took it, but her land to be able to be used as a battle for the Civil War. But in that, she also, instead of being angry and upset, she fed those soldiers. She kept it going. She utilized our motto, even though things happened against her, she continued to lift as she climbed. And so we honor her for that. We honor her for her sacrifice and for her commitment to the United States of America and keeping America safe. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs is committed to keeping the memory and legacy of Elizabeth Proctor Thomas alive through the Lincoln Thomas Day. We are supportive of what the Park Service has done prior. We are supportive of what our own federated sister, Patricia Tyson, has put into making this event a wonderful celebration. We're going to be out there supporting this event. We've put a call out to our federated sisters around the country, but especially in the Northeast region, because that is one of the closest areas to Fort Stevens. So we are excited about being a part of this wonderful celebration, and we are going to continue to move forward with making sure that we are very much involved in making sure that Elizabeth Proctor Thomas is continued to be celebrated down through the years.
Thank you
And
so very much. I would say that perhaps if today's time, again, well before the establishment of the National Association of Colored Women's Club, that Elizabeth Proctor Thomas was doing just that, lifting as she climbed, feeding soldiers, taking up arms to personally protect the president. And so I see where the connection and why the association pays such homage to her. Again, she epitomizes everything that the National Association of Colored Women's Club is doing even back then. And so that brings us forward to today's time. And Miss Patricia Tyson, I'd love to have you talk about how you got involved and why you stood behind this effort and why you're so committed. I know I met you a little over maybe 12, 15 years ago, actually down at the Forts Theater. I met you down there. So even before I came to the Civil War Defenses of Washington to manage these national forts across the Washington, D.C. area, I met you before then, and you've always been just committed to sharing history. So I would love for you to take a moment to share how you became involved with taking up this story. I know that you are a member, the president of the Military Road School Preservation Trust. So maybe we start there and share with us what the Military Road School is, and then bring it all back in together for us to talk about how you have taken this on as a champion. Marvin referenced it. And we've all gathered behind you, and you've got an army of folks behind you now who are willing to support you and ready to support you. So at this time, we'd love to hear more about the Military Road School and the involvement that you have personally taken on to champion this this great event. You're on mute, Ms. Tyson. You're on mute.
Okay,
There you are.
thank you so much. I feel kind of funny because I tell the Military Road School Preservation Trust, we're all in this together. You know, we work together. That's what we have to do in order to uncover truth and act upon it. I have to say that my sister and I are products. We're alumni of the Military Road School, 1375 Missouri Avenue Northwest. And that little school was a mighty place to learn. There was, in that day, you had to learn, and they expected us to continue the legacy and tradition of doing things the right way and knowing about things. And I'm sure God was just out of laughing at me because I don't use this word at all if I can help it, and that's hate. I hated history with a passion. I couldn't stand anything about history. Our teachers would take us, explain the history of the school, and I like that. They would take us to Fort Stevens a certain time of the year, and tell us about the Battle of Fort Stevens. Some of the relatives of those persons who lived in the neighborhood were still living there, and their families were very active in that battle. And that was the only thing that really got my attention. But as time went on and finished school, started working, not paying any attention to the school other than passing by and saying, oh, it's still there. That's nice. And it seems as though one day I went to a service, a church service, and I met someone for the first time since we'd all graduated who was an alum. And we decided to get together later and have lunch. Out of that meeting, we decided we wanted to find other alumni. And I didn't even realize my own father had gone to that school. And so we told him we wanted to get together for a lunch or whatever, and he was fine about that. Then we thought, well, now, why don't we find other alumni? So he knew where all of his people were, but Teresa and I didn't know where ours were. So to make a long story short, we had a reunion of a number of people down at the Sumner School, which houses the records for the DC public school system. Little gentleman down there, a wonderful person, said he'd love to help us. We had to, at some point, Teresa heard on Channel 7 News that DC was getting rid of all of their excess school property. This school was being used, but not necessarily as a school then. And we thought, uh-oh, something's going to happen to the Military Road School. We had better get busy and see if there's anything we can do. And we found the Historic Preservation Review Office here in Washington, D.C. And they helped us and also Sumner School, by writing an application to save the Military Road School. Now, we knew the oral history, but we did not know the written history. And so that started me on an adventure I will never forget, because it was hard to find DC school records or whatever, but I found enough. And the school actually started before probably 1864, because in the District of Columbia, colored communities started their schools in churches or places, other buildings, and the facilities, sometimes the lighting was bad, water leaked in them. And so they were just hanging on, trying to get an education of themselves. And when the war was over, of these forts in the fort circle around Washington, D.C. to protect the federal city, the Military Road School was born out of a army barracks after the war was over. And they paid 25 cents a lesson, I understand, to a gentleman to learn how to read and write and all the things that needed to be done. But this was a community of people that were very active in many things. The first civic association in Brightwood, I understand, was known as the Elizabeth Thomas Civic Association in 1909. And Mrs. Thomas had a great influence, it says, on the civic affairs of the District of Columbia. She was, when she passed away, she was known as a great civic worker, as a heroine of Fort Stevens. And she did much, it says, to influence the civic affairs of DC. Now, we didn't know anything about Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas. We only were trying to save our school. And someone thought there were a lot of people interested in this school, in this building. And someone in our path said, hey, you need to talk to a gentleman, Dr. Philip Ogilvie. He's a historian in DC. He's a professor at George Washington University. So we talked on the phone for 3 years with him. But we came to Fort Stevens Day and found him there with a student from Howard University who portrayed Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas. It was that moment that we met Dr. Ogilvy, and then the wheels began to turn. He had written an entire history on the Battle of Fort Stevens, and he had written an entire document on Mrs. Thomas. Now, when we were in school, we never heard about Mrs. Thomas, but he did so much information on that that we really got curious. And therefore, we started studying this document and finding out all about her. And at that time, the Park Service was looking for community partners to do things that would reveal the history of the Fort Circles group. And so we decided that that would be advantageous. We needed a reason to stay alive and stay visible in Ward 4 as well as the District of Columbia. There were so many people learning about what we were doing that we began to give Civil War symposiums. And out of that, so many people joined us that we renamed, instead of the Military Road School Alumni Association, the Military Road School Preservation Trust. And that is what we are today. We welcome people to join us, but we found out that we were a school, first of all, that learned a lot. And therefore, the legacy of the school lives only if we help other people learn and help them understand the importance of American history. And when you really get into American history, I mean, I can't get enough of it now because I see what really happened, and school books do not carry this information. And for some reason, it is just not well known. And this community was important in the Civil War in that they helped save the federal city. President Lincoln was welcomed in their community. As it sometimes it's said in the newspaper, Mrs. Thomas wanted to protect him and to make sure nothing happened to him. And so she got her old, it says shotgun out. I don't know what she could do with that, but to protect him, to keep the Rebs from harming him. And when she passed away, over her fireplace in her home, there was supposed to be a big picture of President Lincoln there. And so he was respected by the African-American community. There was a book out called They Knew Lincoln, all about the testimonies of the colored people in this federal city who knew him and who he was often with, including even in worship services. So it's a story that needs to be told, and it gives you courage to know how to, if you find out the truth, to stand on it. To our country, we had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Today, the children don't do that. What do they pledge allegiance to? They don't say that. We had to know in the mornings to say the 23rd Psalm. We knew God was with us always and would protect us wherever we walked and went. A little mind like that is so delicate that all of the stuff I began to, that I've had in my adult life, much of it came from my schooling, because we spent more time at school than we did at home because we lived a distance of Silver Spring, and you didn't have public transportation and things like that today where you can get someplace in a few minutes. So this has been an opportunity. I understand Mrs. Thomas did not know how to read or write, and her English was not perfect, but she knew what she was all about. And she knew that in the next generation, and as well as others in that community, that things would happen if they just stood and defended what they knew to be the right thing. So that is basically the history of our school. And when we used to get together all the time, and Teresa and I are the last students that were there. I'm the last graduating class, and she's 2 years behind me. But to hear these older people talk about the history of Military Road School and what they used to do just inspired us. There are things that I cannot tell you that are not written down in the books that happened there. And even the hiding of President Lincoln, it is said that the Grant family here in Washington, D.C., hid him in their kitchen. Now, Mrs. Grant lived at 13th and R Street Northwest for a number of years, a relative. And she also worked for the chancellor of DC public school system. But I asked her, was that story true just about her home and hiding the president there? And she said, yes. So there's a lot of history that is to be uncovered. And I think if the kids in school could go up to Fort Stevens and learn all about that battle and what went on and find out what those cellar doors are all about, they'd get excited. But that's what I want to say to you today. And I'm just so thankful that I've had this opportunity to uncover this kind of history. This is living history.
Kim,
Yes,
I would
ma'am.
like to share with you that the one story that was told by Ms. Thomas was that when they were destroying her property, a tall, slender man dressed in black came and told her that it's hard now, but you will be rewarded. And she stood on that. She believed in that. A lot of people did not believe that that was Lincoln and that she was ever told that. But she consistently told that story over the years. And for a long time, she was not compensated in any way monetarily for the devastation to her life and the use of her property. But in 1916, the year before she died, she was granted $1,835 by the government. So while it might not have been as fair as what people would think, or she had to wait a very long time and be consistent in her faith that she would be compensated as she was promised, it did happen. And it did happen before she passed away, and she passed away in 1917. And I just wanted to make sure that our listening audience did know that that happened.
Thank you so very much. And yes, I was going to mention that encounter. So many people don't know or they doubt it. But again, until her death, on her dying bed, she spoke of her encounter of meeting Abraham Lincoln and her commitment. And Ms. Nancy, I'd sure like to talk with you more as a representative of the National Park Service about where your documentation is that she was actually compensated. We struggled to find where she was actually compensated. It doesn't measure at all to the amount of land that was sacrificed, or even the sacrifices that she made. Again, when she recovered her property, it was not the beautiful orchards and land that she had relinquishedly given over. I tell people in today modern time that was eminent domain. They just came and they just took it. And unfortunately, there were language barriers because at that time they were German soldiers who came to dismantle her property. She had no idea, African-American woman, she had no rights to be able to say, no, you can't do this, step off of my property. But yet she still found it in all of those challenges to smile and to be of, I want to say not great cheer, but honored. She was honored to be a part of that. And so let me add my connection to that, representing the National Park Service and the Battle of Fort Stevens. It is the only Civil War battle to take place in the nation's capital, and that Elizabeth Proctor Thomas was the property owner. And so that is the reason why we, the National Park Service, has stood behind Lincoln Thomas Day like we do, that we commemorate this battle that took place at Fort Stevens over 163 years ago. And just as we talk about the battle, Ms. Tyson and Mr. Jones and so many others on this call knows the Park Services, and particularly Kim Elder's personal interest, to make sure that we tell the story of Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, that we cannot tell the story of the Battle of Fort Stevens without talking about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. And so we'd love to have more information about the compensation that she received. We've worked really hard to see if we can get that, so that any information that you or anyone else may have that could help us confirm and verify that she was compensated. Again, it was nothing in measure to what she sacrificed, but we'd like to have that information. And so I wanted to make sure that we led this discussion now into talking about what we're preparing to do for next Saturday, September the 21st, almost to the year. As Dr. Nance spoke of, it was September 22nd that they celebrated this uncommon relationship because of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. I know that my first year, Ms. Tyson and I worked with the Bridge School across the street, and the school children came to Lincoln Thomas Day and they recited the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a beautiful occasion, and that's what we were told that the school children came to do when they came out to Fort Lincoln every year to honor Miss Thomas and Abraham Lincoln. So anyone from the panel at this point can talk about what you know about that and how the DC Public School students were involved, how the community, the Brightwood community was involved. I know we have representatives from the Brightwood Community Association on the call this evening as well. Talk about Miss Thomas and her involvement even after the war. I believe she taught school for a while. This woman who was never formally educated, thought it not robbery, even in her old age, to go back to the school system and teach the school children. So I'd like to open it to any members of our panel to talk a little bit more about Miss Thomas and or why, you know, some of the things that we've not yet covered this evening on why we celebrate her and this occasion of the Lincoln Thomas Day. And that includes you, Mr. Tupper Jones. Yes, Marvin.
One thing I'd like to point out is that in supporting the fort during the battle, Miss Thomas was at great risk of being enslaved. The rebel forces that came up the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland had enslaved people of color that they captured in Maryland. They also had done that in Pennsylvania when they went up for Gettysburg. And so she was at great risk to be supporting the fort during the war. There was a question of how did she survive? There's a question here on how did she survive during and after. And I'm sure she survived off the fort since she is supplying it as well. But I'm like, are there others that can talk about how she
Well, give us one moment. Give us one moment because we're going to get to those questions. But I want to make sure that Ms. Nance, Ms. Williams, and Ms. Tyson are able, because Marvin, that was a great point about how she put her life at jeopardy. Are there other points that we like to bring to this body on the call tonight that would, again, go right back to why we celebrate her and all that she does, whether it's through the National Association of Colored Women's Club, through the Military Road Preservation Trust, and even with the National Park Service? Did anyone else? Ms. Nance, I think you know that you like to have
I can answer that question that you asked, Mr. Jones, and also say that, again, her commitment to humanity was that she protected her president. She used her own personal grit to say, this is an ugly situation, but I'm going to survive. She was born a free woman. And just as you mentioned, Mr. Jones, it was a risky thing for her to stay in that place. And what she did do was stay on that fort. She was allowed to stay and live out her life at Fort Stevens. And she provided for herself and her family and the soldiers that were there by cooking and cleaning for them. And that provided her sustenance after she had that unfortunate situation where they took her property. But they did not take her dignity, it seems to me. And what she did do is go forward and become an example, and she kept giving. And that to me is why we celebrate her, not just because she had that meeting with President Lincoln, but how she conducted herself after all of that tragedy that happened in her life and how productive she was and how she continued to contribute. So I think it answers the question that you asked, but it also gives credence for why our organization, the National Association of Colored Women, chose to support her. And we have chosen to support other opportunities in our history, like the Frederick Douglass location where you are. Our organization helped to support Miss Pitts Douglass, who helped to get that house in order and keep that house in order until a relationship could be formed with the National Park Service to continue it. And you're sitting there in that beautiful place. So it's just an example of why the National Association of Colored Women helps to do things that help our nation and help our group of women. Many of the women that are in our organization are forerunners to the to the NAACP, in fact, to many other things in our nation. We look at and try to make sure that people have the opportunity to thrive. That's what we do.
Ms. Williams, did you want to add something?
No, I think she said it all. You know.
She certainly did. She certainly did. Well, we're just at about an hour into our discussion. I wanted to make sure Marvin referenced it in the film, but we talk about the fact that we now know that she was compensated, but how we went on to honor her just over almost 10 years ago now with the renaming of the street. Ms. Tyson, would you share with us a little bit about some of the efforts that went in behind renaming Quackenball Street to Elizabeth Proctor Thomas Way? You're on mute.
Because we realized that we were told she was never compensated. There were bills that were in Congress that were passed, but the Congress did not give the money to her. Now, she started out, they estimated that what she lost was worth $10,000. $10,000 in 1864 was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we were, the Congress apparently passed, we're trying to investigate, we're really trying to find out from the Congress if we can get any receipts that say what they gave her and when they gave her. And if they didn't give it to her, who did they give it to? Mm-hmm. She was grandchild of the family, the lady who came here from Eastern Shore, and they came as free people because the grandchildren at that time sued the county. They said they were free because their mother was Irish, and that they were free even though their father was a colored man. And they won their case. And so when they moved up here into DC, it said that this was one of the most gorgeous spots in all of Washington. And it had fruit trees, it had lots of things. They had the family had a farm there. Mm-hmm. And not like today when we run to the Safeway or Giant to get food. They grew their food. They were able to, and neighborhoods were able to sustain themselves by producing their own food, canning it, sharing it, doing whatever was necessary to do this, because their opportunities were very limited and they worked hard to get what they had. So it was a kind of community thing that everybody was in the same boat. And they were all willing to work together to do what they knew to be the best thing for the country. And that is the essence of what it was. We were not invited to come to this country. I believe God made sure we were going to be here by bringing us here. He brought us here. And when we got here, we had to exist with what we saw and how they treated us. But that was okay because they had a greater vision. They weren't willing to lie down and die or just not become involved in the affairs of their area where they were. These were people, hardworking people, who were classy people. And I thank God for them, because I wouldn't be where I was today, where I am today, if it hadn't been for my grandparents and my great-grandparents. So we have a lot to be thankful for, and uncover it and help our next generation. That's the generation that's going to have some tough roads to hoe. But as the general said, the Battle of Fort Stevens was like the moral compass. Which way was this nation going to go? Were we going to live up to those documents or not? And I might just say that our keynote speaker for the program will be the Civil War reenactor, Mr. Michael Crutcher Sr., who portrays Mr. Frederick Douglass. So we'll hear quite a message, hopefully, from him.
Thank you, Ms. Tyson. So before we turn it back over to Jeannie Barr of the Rock Creek Conservancy, I wanted Ms. Tyson to just once again plug this centennial celebration that will take place on the historic grounds of Fort Stevens. When, where, and why? You want to share that plug one more time, Ms. Tyson?
Sure. On Saturday, which is not this Saturday, but next Saturday, September 21st, we will have a program, the 100th anniversary of Lincoln Thomas Day. Now, the women, when they came here in 1924, did not start the celebration at Fort Stevens. They started the celebration at the Emancipation Statue in Lincoln Park in DC up on Capitol Hill. And that was quite a celebration. And it's a history and a story that hopefully NACWC will celebrate before this 100th year of celebration is over, to talk about that area up there. And then they came to Fort Stevens, and of course Mrs. Thomas lived at Fort Stevens, so that's the reason that we sort of spotlight her in that area, because that was her region. And so what the program will be is they're at the fort itself, and we're going to be able to accommodate 200 people under a big tent provided by the National Park Service. It should be a beautiful day, beautiful weather, and there will be community organizations or whatever with tables with information on it. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs will have a table. The Brightwood Community Association will have a table, and they have been so wonderful and so helpful, and will be that day in doing other things. They will be there. And then we have the Military Road School Preservation Trust. We'll have a history on us, and other tables that will be there. That being said, there's so many things to talk about, but the Civil War, when the Confederates were going to approach the federal city, this was known as Washington County, it was thought they would come through the north. And therefore they did. They came through Rockville, they came through Wheaton, they came through Silver Spring, and Silver Spring slowed them up. Whichever day they reached there, it was so hot they could hardly breathe. So they came slowly on, but they hit one of the mansions owned by Montgomery Blair in Silver Spring. A lot of things are named after that family. And they raided his wine cellar. So that slowed them down a bit. And by the time they came out, I'm sure they weren't as strong as they were when they went in. So we've invited the Montgomery Blair High School singers to come and give us some music this day. And the program moves along with reenactors, one to portray President Lincoln, and one to portray Mrs. Thomas. And the young lady, Miss Whitehurst, she's a part of the board for and wanted to do that. So we have those. We'll hear from the local president of NACWC, Dr. Cheryl Lucas Giles. We'll hear from Mrs. Opal Bacon, the national president, who will speak. And as we go through the rest of the program, it should be a very interesting time. Mr. Douglas will speak, and we'll also have authors who've written books about the Civil War who will be there. And they're going to be in the gymnasium of the Emory United Methodist Church to sign books and talk about their books. Marvin will be there showing the movie on Mrs. Thomas. And we have a local historian who lives in Brightwood that he's just a wonderful historian and quite a wonderful presenter. He wants to bring out the role of the U.S. colored troops in the Civil War. So after we've moved on out of the tent at 12 o'clock, we'll go around the grounds, visit the tables. He's going to have a lecture in the tent about the U.S. colored troops. If you've not heard about the U.S. colored troops, that's something to hear. So it's going to be a wonderful day. And we invite everyone to come out, bring your children with you. The Park Service is providing a tent with kids' activities in it so that there will be things that they will learn through that. And I think I have about covered everything. The full grounds will be for reenactors, and we invite you to say to them, who are you? What did you do? And find out something about these people and the Battle of Fort Stevens, or just the general area.
Thank you so very, very much. We're excited. It's going to be an action-filled day filled with living history. So we invite you to come on out on Saturday, September the 21st, on the historic grounds of Fort Stevens at 10 a.m. The program will start. And it's going to be a very fulfilling day. And we'll even have some food trucks there for those who want to stay around a little longer. So we're excited about that as well. I'm going to now turn it over to Jeannie Braha, the executive director for the Rock Creek Conservancy, who has been watching the chat. And I'm not sure if she's had many questions, but we definitely want to make sure that we get to the questions that you do have. If you've not had an opportunity to put your question in the chat, please do so at this time. And again, it's been a pleasure to talk with you all this evening, to talk about one of my heroes. When I came to the park in 2012, I learned so much about this African-American woman who thought again, not robbery, to give up so much so that this country, because of the outcome that her sacrifices, we live a world in which we have democracy and freedom. So again, it's been my pleasure. Thank you, Ms. Tyson. Thank you, Ms. Williams. Thank you, Ms. Nance. Thank you, Marvin Jones. I thank each of you all, and I'll now turn it back over to Jeannie. I'll be back again to say good night, but I'll turn it over to Jeannie at this point now for questions.
Well, I will also thank you, Ms. Kim. Fabulous discussion, and thank you to all of the panelists. I've had the pleasure of meeting each of you at various points of planning this event, and I still learned a ton this evening, which is wonderful. We had some questions about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas herself. Was she married? Did she have children? Can someone tell us a little bit more about her personal life?
She was married. When President Lincoln drove up, when they had to take her out of her home, he knew what was going on. So he went up to the area to see how things were going. And she was standing there under, as the newspaper reports, under a sycamore tree, holding her 6-month-old baby. She and her husband resided in that particular piece of land was left to her by her grandmother. And there's a story about, inheritance of property. The grandchildren were given all that the grandmother left, but that was always the piece that her grandmother left to her right there. And so she lived there. They had a farm, and her husband, in those days, it never says where he was, but many of the colored men were in training over on what we know now as Roosevelt Island for the Civil War as soldiers. They worked in the city. They were getting ready for something, even more than Fort Stevens. They saw the war as something they needed to be ready and trained for. So we don't know where he was, but by the time he got home, he saw what had happened. So that was the situation there. She had some brothers and sisters around the city that owned property, but that was where she dwelled.
Thank you for that. Does anyone want to add to that? Anything else about Ms. Thomas? And there was oh, sorry, Ms. Nance, were you going to answer that?
No, I just said that's what we know.
Fair enough. And there was a question about, so what did they do then? Their farm was taken away, which presumably was their livelihood. What did she and her, I guess, family do after the war? Or during the war, I guess.
Well, after the war, they were allowed to come back to that property and rebuild. So they did, and she had a farm again, because when she passed away in 1917, all the local newspapers carried the headlines: owner of Fort Stevens, heroine of Fort Stevens. Lots of other titles were given to her, made front page news. So it was a farm, and one paper says that, plus she was the founder of Trinity AME Church, one of the founding people of that church in Washington. One of the newspapers says that when they left the church, they took her for her last time past Fort Stevens. And it was as though the animals paused and looked up as something important was coming by. Now, this little lady was apparently a powerhouse. I wish I had met her. But anytime the kind of power that she had to be just an ordinary resident of, the city, that to say that the animals even paused is something else. And of course, she was buried here in Washington, D.C., the cemetery over on Old Bladensburg Road. But after a certain period of time, because of development here in the city, that cemetery was moved into Laurel, Maryland. And she was moved with the rest of them. We tried to find where she was and we couldn't. A relative died and we went to that service. And when we went to that service, that relative was buried over in the cemetery in a particular place. And come to find out from the cemetery people, that was a plot of land that the family owned. And when they took up the folks from DC, they took the headstones and threw them down on the Potomac River. And some years later, they were discovered and trying to identify these people. But they scooped them up and put them out and labeled them, I guess, known only to God. So they could not tell us where she was. If we wanted to do a headstone or a monument to her, we could. But it is not known where she is in the cemetery.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And somewhat related question that perhaps is answered in part by the woman that was in the documentary, Marvin, is do we know where her descendants are today, and are they involved in Lincoln Thomas Day?
Well, well, yes, unfortunately, she's not well and couldn't be with us today. But there is a relative of the family that lives off in near the area of 16th Street. And then there's a relative that was online who apparently has a daycare school that was that claims that she is related to the family. So there are some relatives around, but Alice has not been able to. On 16th Street, we met the family there, and I think that one of the relatives even worked in Mayor Bowser's administration. I'm pretty sure she did. So there are some relatives around. They're few, but they are a few, very few.
And there was a question, is she buried in Harmony Cemetery?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's the cemetery.
Gotcha. And I will take this question that is about the Conservancy, which is, we know you do a lot to protect the plants and wildlife in Rock Creek Park. Does this include Fort Stevens? So Rock Creek Conservancy is the philanthropic and stewardship partner to the entirety of Rock Creek Park, which includes 99 different properties, the main body of Rock Creek Park, but also places from Ward 1 through Ward 5, including quite a few of the forts and other Civil War defense properties. So in fact, one of our mini oases, which is a place we do forest restoration, is in Fort Slocum, and we just yesterday started some large-scale forest restoration work in Fort Totten. So we as a philanthropic partner, we can help facilitate donations to the park to help them be able to do things like preserve buildings as well as plants and wildlife protection. But we always love making sure that the organizations that have been working on the ground with those various parts of the park, like the Military Road Preservation Trust, are front and center in terms of the programming and the vision for those spaces in partnership with the National Park Service. So thanks for that question. We also, this isn't really a question, it's more of a comment. It's for you, Ms. Nance. We have an author, Carl Adams, on the Zoom, and he wrote a book called Nance, Trials of the First Slave Freed by Abraham Lincoln, 1841. Don't know if that's a relative of yours or you want to add anything?
Not that I know of.
All right, well.
Nance was from Illinois, and that was her first name, not her last name.
Apologies.
That's fine.
Thank you for sharing.
clarifying. Excellent. Well, this has been just an incredible evening with so much rich history, some pretty incredible panelists. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And I will reiterate what Ms. Tyson shared, which is that next Saturday, September 21st, is the 100th celebration of Lincoln Thomas Day. We are forever in debt to the National Association of Colored Women's Club for getting that fund started. Hope to see many of you out there during the day. Sounds like there will be a tremendous number of wonderful activities. We will send you a reminder of that, as well as a recording of this program, as well as links to some of the books and other resources that were mentioned. That might not come until Monday because we have a lot going on tomorrow.
By all means, share my email address.
We probably will put that just for Ms. Nance, not to the whole group, but thank you, Mr. Adams. We really appreciate that.
No problem.
All right. Kim, do you want to share any last words before we say goodnight?
No, again, I would like to just say again, thank you to each and every one of you on this call who took the time to join us this evening. We hope that you learned something new today, something that will inspire you. I'd like to again thank the Military Road School Preservation Trust. You have been a gem to work with over these last 12 years or so since I've been here in Rock Creek Park. Thank you to Mr. Jones. Thank you to my sisters. I'd like to just be full disclosure that I too am a proud member of the National Association of Color Women's Club, and my club president is on the call this evening. So I hope I did you well, Dr. Giles. And again, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you to Jeannie and to the Rock Creek Conservancy. Jeannie approached us and said this would be a great opportunity to talk about Lincoln Thomas Day. And so I thank you for bringing this to us. And we hope that we did you well and that this is another added great program to the series. If you are not familiar with the series, we have done a lot of great topics. Go back, take a look at their website, some phenomenal topics that have been discussed through this forum. And this is just yet another one this evening. So I want to take this moment to thank each and every one of you all who had anything to do with developing it, executing it, and for those who participated tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's been a lovely evening. And I want to also give a thanks to Elena, one of our program coordinators here at the Conservancy, who has been helping behind the scenes this evening.
Thank you. Good night all. And I'll see everyone on the